Hello, this is C.L. Barber looking at crime and punishment. Today we're going to be looking at 1500 to 1700 and giving a brief overview of law enforcement, crime and punishment. Each of these sections will be looked at in more depth in future presentations. So firstly, how did early modern England change? Well, between 1500 and 1700, there were changes in how England was ruled. There were changes in religious beliefs and in the gap in wealth between the rich and the poor. Landowners during this period had growing influence in making laws, and there were also tougher laws for crimes against property. England at this time became a Protestant country, which caused much conflict and led to people with wrong religious beliefs being executed. There were also tougher laws against royal and church authority. One new crime during this period was witchcraft. When things went wrong, like bad harvests, people started to blame witches. The trial for witchcraft often, though not always, involved being ducked into water, a bit like trial by ordeal by cold water in medieval times. This shows one example of continuity. The Civil War and all the social upheaval led to an increase in witchcraft accusations, and this was one of the factors which enabled Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, to increase the witchcraft accusations, particularly in the 1640s. Also, the religious changes caused by Henry VIII when he changed England to Protestantism led to increased accusations. There were also the new crimes of treason and heresy. For example, the law on treason was strengthened. Treason is a crime against authority, usually against the king, and heresy was a crime against the church. By 1534, when Henry VIII became the head of the church, where they still had a Catholic ethos but Protestants wanted more change, they become entwined. Because of this, people started to question religion. The people who questioned religion were Protestants, and they wanted church reform under Martin Luther and thought that Henry VIII would give this to them. However, he didn't make England completely Protestant, only changing the leadership. The punishment for treason during this period was hanging, drawing and quartering, and the victims' body parts were displayed as a warning. The punishment for heresy was being burned at the stake. Another new type of crime was being a vagabond. Due to an increase in population, a rise in the food prices, the increase in enclosure by landowners, and the fall in wages, many people moved to towns to try to find jobs and ended up becoming migrants. The 1547 Vagrancy Act punished any vagabond out of work, and the Relief of the Poor Act of 1597 used harsh corporal punishments against vagabonds. There were more than this, and these will be looked at in a later presentation. Finally, the 1601 Poor Law was where poor relief was given to the deserving poor, such as the elderly and disabled. During this period, new houses of correction were also set up. Another new type of crime was smuggling. In the 1600s, the government made luxury goods imported into England more expensive by adding an import duty. This was a tax which went straight to the government. So anyone who smuggled in these goods could make money by selling them for cheaper, as they weren't paying tax. This was considered a social crime. As people benefited, they didn't report the smugglers to the authorities, and even the rich took advantage of the cheaper goods available. Because it was stopping the government in getting taxes, this is a crime against authority. Another new type of crime was poaching and trespassing. Just as in medieval England, those with land wanted to protect it from anyone who wanted to steal from it, so this is an extension of the forest laws. The rural poor would use the public land to hunt for food or firewood. However, by the 1500s, more landowners were enclosing the land because they wanted to make a profit from the wool trade. This made it difficult for the poor to survive. This led to many people using that land to get firewood and to catch animals to eat. This resulted in a new law in 1671, which was the Game Act. This made hunting for animals and fish on enclosed lands illegal. This resulted in poaching gangs being formed, and again was seen as a social crime. For a short period of time there was also the new crime of Puritan Crimes. This was another example of a change in definition. During the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell had won against Charles I, who was beheaded, and as a result, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector. Now, Cromwell was an extreme Protestant called a Puritan, and so he believed in very strict rules on behaviour, and as a result brought in some laws. Some of the activities which were banned were drinking alcohol, feasting and games at Christmas. This was a huge change and showed just how much control a leader had over crime and what was considered a crime during this period. There was also some changes and some continuity with law enforcement. One of the reasons for this was the impact of the growing towns and the population. The population between 1500 and 1700 grew massively. In 1500 the population was about 2.5 million, but by 1700, just 200 years later, it had over doubled to be 6 million. This particularly impacted on towns, so between 1400 and 1700 the population of London grew from 30,000 to 50,000 people. Ports in places such as London and Bristol also grew as a result of increased trade with Europe, and this included the slave trade. People would move from villages to towns for better trade, for better transport and opportunities. However, as a direct result, it led to more crimes such as pickpocketing and the rise of the number of vagabonds. So, how did law enforcement change? Well, town constables, who had been introduced before 1500, were now more widely used, and they were paid by the town authorities. Town constables would monitor the work of night watchmen who patrolled the streets between 10 o'clock at night and dawn. These would ring a bell to let people know if a criminal was on the loose. As constables and night watchmen weren't always effective, some people, rich people, hired thief-takers. These were hired to catch a criminal and take them to the police. However, although they received a reward and were good, many of them were corrupt, being thieves themselves. So what stayed the same for law enforcement? Well, villages and small town communities still took the leading role in catching and chasing criminals. Villages stayed small, so people still knew each other. There was still no national police force, and at this time standards of law enforcement and policing still varied depending on where someone lived in a country. So looking at punishments, one change was that of transportation. From the 1600s, many criminals were transported to English colonies in North America and then to Australia. This was considered a really harsh punishment, as they were held in chains, held under decks, and then served between 7 to 14 years. Even though they were freed after this because they had earned little to no money and had no way of returning home, their lives were still bad. Before 1770, between 50,000 and 80,000 people were transported, including men, women and children, and many would die on the journey out there. This was also used to increase our population in our new colonies, so it was seen as a way of helping them to rehabilitate rather than through death, as well as to make sure that we had increased numbers on our newly acquired lands. With no prisons, this was a way of keeping criminals off the streets. There was some continuity with punishments in the medieval period. For example, many old corporal punishments remained the same. We still had stocks and pillories. There were still fines and corporal punishments, including whipping, maiming and branding. We also kept hanging and burning. Punishments were still used as retribution and deterrence, as most people still believed in this type of punishment as effective, although with transportation we also had the increase of removal from society. During this period, prisons weren't usual punishments. Before 1500s, prisons were used to hold people awaiting trial. They were locked in rooms or a local castle or a village building. Prisoners during this period had to pay wardens for food and clothing, or otherwise they went without. Another reason for keeping people in prisons was because they was in debt. However, if they were in debt, then they wouldn't be able to afford to pay for their food and clothing. During this period, men, women and children were all locked up together, and conditions were dirty, with people often dying of diseases such as typhus. A new punishment were the houses of correction, which were introduced. By 1556, houses of correction were introduced, which were newer purpose-built prisons. The first of these was Bridewell Prison, which was used to punish the poor of all ages. Inmates had to do hard labour. This was seen as a form of rehabilitation and reform, as well as a deterrent. This prison influenced other prisons to open up around the country. So if you're looking to revise for this topic, again remember that it is mostly about continuity and about change. So the three main areas are law enforcement, crimes and punishment. For each one of those you need to think about what stayed the same and what was new. So for example, law enforcement, the continuity would still be the use of tippings and the hue and cry and the use of constables, although the change would be the fact that constables had a bigger role and there were more of them and they were paid, as well as the night watchmen and the thief takers. For crimes, you have a lot of continuity with thieving, etc. But obviously there's the change in the role of vagabonds, in witchcraft and in treason and heresy, and what was considered a crime because of the change in definitions by the monarch. And for punishments, the continuity is still the fines and the Stockton pillories and the corporal punishments, although you've obviously got the change with the Bridewell prison and the houses of correction, as well as with transportation. For each one of those, you would need to decide how far it changed and how far it stayed the same. You might also be asked to think about the changing nature of punishments and whether it was still deterrent and retribution, or whether during this period there is some attempt at reform and rehabilitation. Thank you very much for listening. This is C.L. Barber, 1977.